Sheriff Dorian Pike slammed both palms flat on Hattie Mercer's kitchen table, so hard the coffee cups rattled off the edge and shattered on the floor. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at her. "You got 3 days," he said. 3 days to produce a bill of sale for that horse, or I'm taking this property as evidence in a theft investigation. He smiled then, slow, deliberate, the kind of smile a man uses when he already knows how the story ends. "And between you and me, Hattie, I don't think you've got one." Picked up his hat from her table like he owned that too, and walked out without closing the door behind him. She stood in her own kitchen, surrounded by broken cups and the smell of spilled coffee, and understood with absolute clarity that she had perhaps 2 weeks before she lost everything. Everett had died trying to build. If you have ever stood in a room after someone walked out of it and felt the walls move closer, then you already know exactly where Hattie Mercer was that morning. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, stories about ordinary people who find something iron inside themselves when everything falls apart, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Every single comment means something to me. Now let's go back to Wyoming. 1888. And to a woman the town of Oak Hollow had already decided was finished. Hattie Mercer was 39 years old, and she looked every year of it. Not in a way that suggested she had lived badly, but in the way of someone who had worked hard at things that didn't always work back. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders, heavy through the middle, and she had long since stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Everett had loved her exactly as she was, which was one of the reasons she had married him, and one of the reasons losing him had left such a specific, irreplaceable hole in her chest. He had died 14 months ago. Fever, moving fast. The doctor came out from town on the second day, looked at Everett, and by the third day, there wasn't anything left to look at. Hattie had buried him herself because the ground was frozen, and the 2 hands they'd hired for the season had already left for warmer work. She had swung a pickaxe for 4 hours in January earth, and when she was done, she sat beside the mound and didn't cry, because crying felt like a luxury she couldn't afford yet, still hadn't gotten around to it. What she had gotten around to was debt. Everett's debts, which he had hidden from her with the particular stubbornness of a man who believed things would turn around. They hadn't turned around. There was a note at the bank in Casper, a smaller note with the feed store in town, and a third obligation she'd only discovered when a man named Aldrich showed up in February with paperwork she didn't recognize and a manner that suggested he would be back with something worse if she didn't figure it out quickly. She had been managing, barely, but managing. She'd sold off 2 of their 3 milk cows, kept the garden going through a late frost, taken in, mending from 3 families in Oak Hollow who were kind enough not to mention they were doing her a favor. She had 1 horse left, a plow mare named Bess, who was 20 years old and moved like she knew it. And she had 31 acres of land that the bank hadn't gotten around to calling in yet. And then Everett's red stallion had turned up in her barn. She still didn't know exactly how it had gotten there. She'd gone out one morning in late March to feed Bess, and there it was, enormous, red as brick dust, with a neck like a draft horse and eyes that tracked her movements with an intelligence that made the hair on her arms stand up. It had been there all night. The barn latch showed no signs of being forced. Bess was in the corner, pressed as far from the animal as she could get, which Hattie completely understood. She'd spent the first hour trying to figure out how to get it out of the barn without losing a hand. The stallion was not friendly. It wasn't precisely aggressive either. It watched her with the patient, calculating the tension of an animal that was deciding something, and Hattie got the impression it was deciding whether it's worth the trouble of injuring. She brought it a bucket of oats. It ignored the oats and kept watching her. She tried a rope. It pinned its ears and she stepped back fast. She found an apple from the cold cellar, soft and half wrinkled, and held it out on a flat palm. and after a long moment of deliberation, the stallion stretched its neck forward and took it from her hand with a surprising delicacy. They had arrived at something like a provisional understanding. Found the brand 2 days later, when the animal finally let her close enough to run a brush along its flank. Double diamond mark was burned clean and deep into the left hip. She'd stared at it for a long time, the brush going still in her hand, whilst something cold settled in her stomach. Everyone in the county knew the Blackthorn brand. Everyone in the county knew the story that went with it, told in the particular hushed, sideways manner that people use when they're not sure whether to be frightened or fascinated. 6 years ago, Silas Vane had been the most prosperous rancher in the territory, owned the largest in the mountains, ran 1,000 head, built a house that people drove 20 miles to look at. Then his wife was killed, and something in Silas Vane had broken clean through, and he had shut the iron gates of Blackthorn Ranch and not come out since. Some people said he'd gone mad with grief. Some people said he'd been crippled in the same attack that killed his wife. Some people said there was no Silas Vane anymore, just the ranch, and the gates, and the stories that gathered around both like weather. Hattie had always figured the truth was probably quieter and sadder than any of the stories. She'd been right about things like that before. But standing in her barn, with a brush in one hand and the cold weight of recognition in her stomach, she wasn't thinking about Silas Vane's tragedy. She was thinking about Sheriff Dorian Pike. Pike had been sheriff of Oak Hollow for 11 years, which was long enough to arrange things the way he liked them and call the arrangement order. He was not the worst man Hattie had ever encountered. That honor went to her father, but he was the most systematically dishonest, which in some ways was worse. He had a talent for finding the exact pressure point in any situation and leaning on it until whatever was there collapsed in the direction he needed it to go. He'd done it to the Halverson family 3 years ago, taken their north pasture on a disputed water claim that everyone in town knew was manufactured. He'd done it to old Chester Buell, who'd lost his live house after a fire that several people privately suspected wasn't accidental. He'd been patient with Hattie. She understood now that his patience had been strategic. A widow with debts and a failing farm didn't need much pushing. He could afford to wait. He stopped waiting the morning after she found the stallion. She didn't know how he'd found out so fast. Someone in town must have seen the animal in her field, or word had traveled the way it did in small places, through the particular efficiency of people, with not enough of their own business to attend to. Pike arrived before she'd finished her breakfast, and he was alone, which told her something. Men who came alone to these conversations were either confident or careless, and Pike was never careless. He sat at her kitchen table without being invited. He accepted the coffee she offered, because refusing it would have been a tactical error, a signal that he'd come for something other than conversation. He talked about the weather, about the condition of the road, between town and the foothills, about the general hardships of the season. Hattie let him talk. She had learned, from years of dealing with difficult men, that silence was almost always the stronger position. Then he mentioned the horse. He mentioned it the way people mention things they've been thinking about the entire time, offhand, like it had just occurred to him. She had a branded animal on her property, he said, branded with the Blackthorn mark. That was a serious matter. Possession of stolen livestock was a criminal offense in Wyoming territory, carrying penalties that could include forfeiture of property. He watched her face while he said it. Hattie kept her face the way she'd learned to keep it still, attentive, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. She told him the horse had appeared in her barn. She said she didn't know how it had come to be there. She said she had not purchased it and had no bill of sale for it because she had not purchased it. He nodded slowly, like a man hearing something that confirmed a prior suspicion. He said that was all very interesting. He said that unfortunately, without documentation, the circumstances looked a particular way. He said he was going to give her time 3 days to produce evidence of legal acquisition, and that if she couldn't do that, he would have no choice but to investigate further. The word investigate in Pike's mouth meant something specific. It meant the farm. He slammed his palms on the table, and the coffee cups went, and he took his hat and left. And Hattie stood in the wreckage of her kitchen and understood that 3 days was not enough time to solve the problem through any conventional means. She couldn't go to a lawyer. She'd tried that with Everett's debts, and the nearest lawyer who wasn't in Pike's pocket was in Casper, 2 days' ride each way. She couldn't go to another lawman. The county sheriff was Pike's cousin, a fact everyone in town knew, and no one mentioned publicly. She couldn't sell the horse, because selling stolen property would only accelerate the investigation. Pike was already setting up. She supposed, simply let the horse go, open the barn door and walk away and hope it disappeared into the hills. But Pike had already established that she'd had it. Its absence wouldn't clear her. It would only remove the one piece of evidence that might, handled correctly, clear her instead. She swept up the broken cups. She made fresh coffee. She sat down at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and worked through every option she could think of, the way Everett had taught her, list them all, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones, because sometimes the worst idea on the list is only the worst idea until you look at it from a different angle. It took her most of the morning to arrive at the only angle that made any sense. She needed to return the horse, not to Pike, not to the county, to Silas Vane himself. And she needed something in writing when she did it, a receipt, a document, something on paper with a signature that proved she had come to Blackthorn Ranch in good faith and handed over an animal she had not stolen. That piece of paper would be the difference between keeping her farm and losing it. Problem was the 10 miles of mountain trail between her property and Blackthorn's iron gates, a trail that was treacherous under normal conditions and was currently running with snowmelt from a late-season thaw. The second problem was that Silas Vane had not, by any account, welcomed a visitor in 6 years. The third problem was the horse itself, which had made its opinion of being handled quite clear over the past several days. Hattie looked at the list of problems. Then she looked out the window at the barn. She thought about Everett, who had always said that the thing about an impossible situation was that it usually wasn't. It was just a situation that required you to do something you'd prefer not to. She got up, put on her heaviest coat, found the lead rope she hadn't been able to use yet, and went out to the barn. The stallion watched her come in. It pinned its ears. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the last of the soft apples from the cold cellar, held it out, and waited. Horse deliberated. It was good at deliberating. So was she. After a long moment, it stretched its neck forward and took the apple. "All right," Hattie said, to the horse, to the empty barn, to the general situation. "Let's see what the man has to say for himself." She got the lead rope on the third try. Stallions expressed its displeasure, loudly enough that Bess retreated to the far corner and pressed her nose against the wall. Hattie held on. She'd held on to worse things than an unhappy horse. By mid-morning, she was moving up the mountain trail, the red stallion pulling against the rope and testing her arm every quarter mile, and the peaks ahead of her still white with winter that hadn't quite decided to leave. She didn't know what she'd find at the iron gates. She didn't know if Silas Vane would shoot her on sight, or refuse to answer, or be dead already, and the whole story just an echo rattling around an empty property. What she knew was that she had 3 days, and this was the only idea on her list that had any chance of working. Hattie Mercer was 39 years old, and she had buried her husband in frozen ground, and she had held on to a failing farm through 14 months of a county that wanted to take it from her. Kept walking. The stallion smelled the storm before Hattie did. She'd been watching the animal for the better part of 3 hours on the trail, learning its habits the way you learn anything unfamiliar through attention, and a willingness to be wrong about your first impressions. It had settled into a grudging rhythm with her, not cooperative exactly, but no longer actively fighting the rope. It moved with a kind of contained power that reminded her of Everett's older brother, a man who was always about to say something he'd decided against. Then somewhere around the second hour, the stallion's ears went flat and it planted its feet and refused to move, and Hattie walked into its shoulder before she understood what was happening. She looked up. The sky to the northwest had turned the particular greenish-gray color that people in Wyoming either learned to respect quickly or didn't last long enough to learn anything else. Clouds were moving fast and low, dragging a dark curtain across the ridgeline, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to register all of this. The wind, which had been a mild inconvenience, became suddenly purposeful. She had maybe 20 minutes. The gates of Blackthorn Ranch were still a mile and a half ahead of her by her best estimate, which meant she was too far up the mountain to go back and not far enough to be sure of reaching shelter. The trail to her left dropped into a creek bed that would be running hard with snowmelt. The trail to her right rose steeply into exposed rock. There was no good option, which was becoming a familiar condition. She pulled hard on the lead rope. The stallion, apparently having made its point about the weather, moved. They covered the next mile and a half at a pace that cost Hattie considerably. She was breathing in a way she didn't love by the time the iron gates came into view through the first scattering of rain. Dark vertical bars set into a stone post on either side of the trail, a chain threaded through and padlocked. Beyond the gate she could see the outline of a large structure, but the rain was coming harder now, and the details blurred. She hammered on the iron bars with the flat of her hand. The sound was swallowed immediately by the wind and the rain, and the rising noise of water moving fast somewhere below the trail. She hammered again, louder. Nothing. She stepped back and looked at the property. There was a light somewhere in the structure, not much of one, the kind of light that comes from a single lamp in a single room, but it was there. Someone was inside. "Silas Vane," she called out, loud as she could manage with her lungs working against the altitude and the cold. "My name is Hattie Mercer. I have your horse. I walked 10 miles up this mountain to return it to you, and there is a considerable storm arriving, and I would appreciate if you would come to the gate." The rain answered her. The stallion pressed close against her back, which she chose to interpret as solidarity rather than self-interest. She waited. The light in the structure moved. It took another 3 minutes, she counted them, before she heard footsteps, irregular ones, a pattern that suggested one leg doing more work than the other. Then a figure emerged from the dark, carrying a lantern, and stopped about 10 feet from the gate. He was not what she'd expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. The stories varied enough that any version was possible, but the man standing on the other side of the iron bars was tall and lean in a way that suggested he'd once been broader. Like someone had taken a bigger man and subtracted things from him over a period of years. His face was turned partially away from the lantern light, but she could see enough, a beard that had gone past the point of intention into something more like indifference, and along his left jaw and neck, a ridge of scar tissue that the lantern caught in a way that made it look almost copper-colored. He held a Winchester rifle loose in his right hand, not raised, not pointed, just present. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the stallion, and something happened in his face that Hattie couldn't entirely read, not quite recognition, not quite pain, something adjacent to both. "How'd you get him?" Silas Vane said. It wasn't quite a question. "He appeared in my barn 3 days ago. I don't know how. I found the brand, and I came to return him." The rain was running down the back of her neck now, and her coat was soaked through at the shoulders. "I need a receipt. A document signed by you, stating that I returned this animal on this date. I need it in writing." He stared at her. "You walked 10 miles up a mountain in a spring storm," he said slowly, "to return a horse that wasn't yours, and you want a receipt." "I want a receipt," she said. "Yes." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. She couldn't tell if it was the beginning of a smile or just a muscle doing something involuntary. "Why?" he said. "Because Sheriff Pike came to my door yesterday morning and told me I have 3 days to produce documentation proving I didn't steal your horse. Without that documentation, he intends to seize my property." A signed receipt from you stating I returned. The animal, voluntarily, is the only piece of paper that prevents that from happening." Silas was quiet for a moment. The rain intensified, and somewhere down the mountain, a sound like thunder moved through the ground, rather than the air, not weather, she realized, but water, a large amount of it moving fast. Turned his head toward that sound. Then he looked at the trail behind her. "The lower creek's gone over," he said. "You hear that?" She heard it. She'd been trying not to think about what it meant. "The trail's gone," he said. "You can't go back down tonight. I'm aware." "You walked up here knowing that was possible?" "I walked up here knowing I didn't have a better option," Hattie said. "Those are two different things." He stood there in the rain, looking at her for another moment, and she could see him working through something reluctance against pragmatism, against some other consideration she couldn't identify from the wrong side of an iron gate. Finally, he set the lantern down, pulled a key from his coat pocket, and undid the padlock. The chain rattled free, and he pushed one side of the gate open, just far enough. "Bring the horse around back," he said. "There's a lean-to. He knows where it is." He was right about that. The stallion, the moment it was through the gate, walked ahead of them with its ears forward, and its step changed purposeful, like something that recognized where it was. Hattie followed it, and Silas followed her, limping noticeably on his left side, the Winchester still in his hand. The lean-to's was solid, well-built, clearly maintained, even if nothing else on the property showed the same attention. The stallion walked in and went directly to a particular spot along the back wall and stood there, and Hattie unclipped the lead rope and stepped back and tried to catch her breath. "There's water in the bucket," Silas said from behind her. "He won't drink from a new one, so don't move it." "Does he have a name?" A pause. "Cannon." She looked at the horse. "Suits him." She followed Silas into the main structure, which from the outside had suggested ruin and from the inside revealed something more complicated. It was a large space that had once been arranged for a particular kind of life. She could see the bones of it, the scale of the rooms, quality of what had been built but 6 years, of a single man living alone in it, had rearranged things into a different configuration entirely. The furniture was sparse and pushed to the walls. There were tools on the kitchen table, books stacked in 3 corners, a wood stove that was doing its job efficiently, the only thing in the room that seemed fully operational in the way it had been intended. Silas lit a second lamp from the first and set them both on the table, moving the tools to the floor in a way that suggested he was not accustomed to having anyone look at them. Pulled 2 chairs to the stove and then stood looking at them, as if he wasn't sure how that had happened. "Sit," he said, in the voice of a man who'd given orders once and had mostly stopped. Hattie sat. She pulled off her wet coat and draped it over the back of the chair and extended her hands toward the stove. The warmth was almost painful after the cold. Silas remained standing, which she suspected was something he did when he was uncertain, kept himself vertical and mobile as a hedge against whatever came next. He'd set the Winchester against the wall, but not far from his right hand. "Pike came himself," he said. "It wasn't a question either." "He did." "He come alone?" "Yes." Silas moved to the stove and added a log. "That means he wants the farm. When he comes with a deputy, it means he wants you scared. When he comes alone, it means he's already decided how it ends, and he's just going through the steps." Hattie looked at him. "You know Pike?" "I know Pike," he said in a tone that closed the door on any further discussion of how. She let it close. She was good at that. The storm hit the roof with a sound like gravel being poured from height, and both of them looked up involuntarily, and then the silence between them rearranged itself into something slightly less hostile. "How long's the trail been down when it floods?" she asked. 36 hours usually. Sometimes 48 if the melt keeps coming. He sat down finally, across from her, and she got a clearer look at his face. He was younger than the stories had made him mid-40s, she thought, though the beard and the scar and the general quality of a man who hadn't been sleeping well made it hard to be certain. His eyes were gray and tired and watchful, in the specific way of someone who had spent years attending to threats that might or might not materialize. I need paper, Hattie said, and something to write with. I need the receipt before I leave. I haven't agreed to give you one. She looked at him steadily. You let me in your gate. It was raining. The rain didn't change what I need. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't spoken to anyone from Oak Hollow in 6 years, he said. Last time a person from town came up this trail, they came with 4 men and a court order they'd manufactured out of thin air, trying to seize the north pasture. He looked at his hands, which were rough and large and resting on his knees with a deliberate stillness. I ran them off the property. I'm not here for your land, Hattie said. I'm here with your horse and a need for a piece of paper. People from that town always want something. I told you exactly what I want. You told me what you want from me, Silas said. I'm asking why I should help you get it. Fair question. She'd thought about it on the trail, in between managing the horse and watching the sky and calculating distances. She gave him the honest answer. Because if you don't, Pike takes my farm on a theft charge that won't hold up in front of any judge who isn't in his pocket, but will hold up long enough for the property to transfer. Because I am a widow with debt and no political allies, and the only thing standing between me and losing everything my husband spent his life building is a piece of paper with your name on it. She paused. And because returning stolen property that landed in my barn through no action of my own is the right thing to do, and I'd like to believe that still means something even in this county. Silas looked at her for a long time. The fire worked in the stove. Rain drove against the single window in rhythmic bursts. How'd it get to your barn? He said. I told you. I don't know. Think harder. She opened her mouth to say she had thought about it, and then something stopped her, the quality of his question, the specific weight he'd put on it. He wasn't asking for her benefit. He already had a theory. Who would have had access to your barn at night? He said. Who knew you well enough to know you wouldn't check the brand for a few days? Who needed the horse somewhere? It couldn't be easily traced back to them. Hattie sat with that. I don't lock the barn in at night, she said slowly. Everett never did. Everyone in the county knows that. She thought about the trail that ran along her property's eastern edge, who used it, who had reason to move through that area after dark. The feed store man. The hands who worked the Garvey place last summer, they camped on that trail for 2 weeks. The Dobbins boys, but they're 12 and 14. She paused. Pike's deputy uses that trail to get to his sister's place. Not the deputy, Silas said. Something in his voice made her go still. Cannon was taken from this property 16 months ago, he said. I didn't report it because reporting it to Pike would have been the same as burning the paperwork myself. I tracked the animal as far as the county line and then lost the trail. He looked at the fire. 18 months. Whoever had him didn't want him found, but they also couldn't sell him. The brand is too well known. So he moved around, ended up somewhere inconvenient to whoever was holding him. He stopped, and they needed to put him somewhere he'd be found by someone who had no connection to them, Hattie said. Someone who'd get blamed for having him. Someone Pike already had a reason to go after. The room was very quiet for a moment, except for the fire and the rain. Dole him, Hattie said. Silas didn't answer right away. He got up and went to the window and stood looking at nothing. The rain had made it a dark mirror. She watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand had moved, without apparent intention toward the wall where the Winchester leaned. My brother, he said finally. Corbin. She waited. Corbin Vane. He said the name like it cost him something. Younger than me by 8 years. I raised him after our parents died. He was. He stopped, reconsidered. He's a gambler and a drunk, and he's been in Pike's pocket since before Pike was sheriff. He was at Blackthorn the night my wife was killed. Hattie felt something drop in her chest. He was involved in her death. He was the reason she died. Silas turned from the window. His face was flat and controlled in the way of someone who has had years to practice controlling it, but the control was costing him tonight, visibly, in a way it probably didn't usually. He came to rob the ranch house. He didn't know Margaret was home. Or maybe he did and decided it didn't matter. I was in the south pasture. I heard the shot. He stopped again. By the time I got to the house, she was gone and he was gone. The only witnesses were the two hands I had at the time, and both of them left the county inside a week. Pike made sure of that. And you've been up here ever since, Hattie said. Corbin has friends in the territory, friends who would make any formal accusation dangerous for the accuser. He said it without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. I had a leg that didn't work right after a fall I took that winter, and no wife, and a brother who'd killed her and walked free because the law in this county does what Pike tells it to. So yes, I've been up here. Hattie looked at this man who had been living alone with all of that for 6 years, in a house that still had the shape of a different life in it. And she understood something she hadn't fully understood before she'd come through his gate. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting for something that had enough weight to move the situation. And the situation hadn't moved because nobody from outside had given him anything to work with. "Where is Corbin now?" she said. "In town. He's been in Oak Hollow for the past 2 months. I've had a man in Casper who sends me word occasionally." Silas came back to the chair and sat down heavily. "He's been meeting with Pike. Regularly. Whatever they're planning, it involves Blackthorn. The North Pasture," Hattie said. "The one they tried to take 6 years ago. The water rights that go with it. Whoever controls that water controls 3 other ranches in this valley. It's worth considerably more than the land itself." She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the chain of events that had led her up a mountain in a spring storm to sit in a ruined house with a scarred hermit and discover that the piece of paper she needed was connected to a murder that was connected to a theft, that was connected to a land scheme that had been operating for 6 years right underneath the feet of everyone in Oak Hollow. "The receipt," she said. "Yes. If you give me a signed receipt proving I returned the horse in good faith, it clears me with any judge who's not in Pike's pocket, which means Pike can't use me as leverage." "Correct. But it also tells Pike you're alive and aware of what he's doing," she said, "and that you've been in contact with someone from town. Changes his timeline." Silas looked at her with something that might have been the first unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "You think fast," he said. "I've had to," she said, which wasn't something she usually admitted to anyone. Storm outside was at full force now, driving rain against every surface with a kind of democratic violence, and the creek below the trail would be completely impassable until morning at the earliest. Hattie was not going home tonight. That was simply true, and spending energy on the fact of it was wasteful. She thought about what Silas had said about Corbin, about Pike, about the water rights. She thought about the 3 days she had left on Pike's deadline, which was now closer to 2.5. She thought about the signed receipt, which was the thing she'd climbed this mountain for, and she thought about what else it might be possible to do with her presence here, her two days of necessity before she had to go back down. "I can help you," she said. Silas looked at her. "Not with a gun," she said. "I have some competence there, but that's not what I mean. I mean with the other thing. The federal thing." She'd been thinking about it while he talked, assembling pieces. If Corbin killed your wife and Pike suppressed the evidence, that's federal territory. Obstruction of a murder investigation. If there's also a land scheme involving water rights across multiple properties, that compounds it. The territorial marshal in Cheyenne has jurisdiction over Pike. She looked at him steadily. Someone has to file the complaint, and someone has to be able to testify to a chain of custody on the horse, proving it was stolen from you, that it ended up in my barn, that I returned it voluntarily, and that the whole sequence was engineered by Pike and your brother to frame me and provide cover for seizing my property. "I've been alone on this mountain for 6 years, Silas said. "I'm not exactly positioned to walk into the territorial marshal's office." "No," she said, "but I am." He was very still. "I have nothing to lose anymore that I'm not already losing," Hattie said, and she heard how that sounded. Too bare. Too much like asking for sympathy, and she corrected it. "What I mean is that Pike is going to take my farm regardless, unless I give him a reason not to. The receipt is a reason not to, but it's a small reason he'll find another angle. He always finds another angle." She leaned forward. But if he's looking at a federal investigation, if there's a complaint filed in Cheyenne with specific names and specific charges and a witness who can speak to the theft and the murder, the land schemes, that's not an angle he can work around. That's a different kind of problem entirely. Silas sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man trying to clear something that wouldn't clear. When he dropped his hands, he looked at her with an expression that was tired and wary, and something else she placed after a moment as cautious. "You'd have to go back to Oak Hollow," he said. "Before you go to Cheyenne, you'd have to walk into town with the receipt and whatever else I give you and stand in front of Pike and Corbin. I know. Corbin has killed before. I know that too. He's not a careful man," Silas said. He doesn't think through consequences. He reacts. If you walk into Pike's office with documentation connecting him to the theft and the murder, he might react badly. I'm aware. "You're a large woman," Silas said, without inflection, just as a fact. "You're not armed, and you're not—" "I have a revolver at home," Hattie said. "I haven't used it in a few years, but I shot competitively when I was younger, before I was married. I still know which end to point." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want out of this?" he said. "Actually want, not just the farm." It was a better question than most people would have thought to ask her, and she sat with it for a moment before she answered. "I want to stop losing ground," she said. "I've been losing ground since Everett died, and I want it to stop. I want to bury the right people instead of the wrong ones. I want a county where Pike can't walk into a widow's kitchen and slam his hands on the table and take her life's work because he's decided he wants it." She looked at her own hands. "And I want Everett's name clean. He bought that horse in good faith. He didn't know where it came from. He died without knowing he'd been handed a stolen animal, and I'd like that cleared before any more time passes." Fire popped. Rain drove hard against the window. Silas Vane sat in the dim light of his ruined house and looked at the woman who had walked 10 miles up a mountain in a spring storm to return a horse she hadn't stolen, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he got up, went to the desk against the far wall, and found paper and a pen. "I'll write the receipt," he said. "Date, description of the animal, your name, my name, a statement that you returned him voluntarily and without prior knowledge of the theft." He sat down at the desk with his back partly to her. "I'll also write out a statement about Corbin. What I saw, what I know, what can be verified. You can take it to whoever will listen." Hattie watched him write. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned it properly and maintained the habit even when there was no one to read the result. "There's one more thing," he said without turning. "What?" "When you go back to Oak Hollow, before you go to Cheyenne," he paused, the pen stopping for a moment, "you'll need to do it right. Not cautious, not careful. You walk in there and you put the receipt on Pike's desk and you say my name out loud in front of witnesses. Make it public. If it's public, he can't make it quiet. I know he'll come after you. I know that, too." He turned and looked at her. "You're not afraid." "I didn't say that," Hattie said. "I said I." "No." He turned back to the paper. She listened to the rain and the fire and the sound of the pen moving, and she thought about what waited for her at the bottom of the mountain once the trail cleared, and she decided that what she felt was not exactly fear and not exactly courage, but something in between the ordinary, human condition of understanding, clearly what is ahead of you and choosing to walk toward it anyway, because the alternative is worse. Outside, the storm had no opinion about any of this, simply continued. She pulled her damp coat tighter and waited for the paper that might, if everything went as badly wrong as it possibly could, at least ensure that what happened to her was documented somewhere with someone's real name attached to it. It was not a comfortable thought. It was, however, a thought she could work with. The trail cleared by mid-morning of the second day. Hattie knew it before Silas told her she'd been listening to the creek since before dawn, tracking the change in its voice the way she'd learned to track weather, by pitch and rhythm rather than sight. When the roaring dropped to a lower register and steadied itself. She got up from the chair where she'd slept in 2-hour intervals and started pulling on her coat. Silas was already at the stove. He'd been up before her, which she suspected meant he hadn't slept much at all. He set a cup of coffee on the table without comment and went back to the window. "Trail be soft for the first half-mile," he said. "Watch the left edge past the second bend. The ground undercuts there when it's been wet. I'll watch it. You should eat something before you go." She almost said she was fine, which would have been partly true and partly the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent too many years proving she didn't need anything from anyone. Instead, she sat down and ate the biscuits he put in front of her, which were dense and slightly burned on the bottom. And exactly what she needed. The documents were folded inside her coat, against her chest. In the inner pocket, she'd sewn herself 3 winters ago for carrying valuables in bad weather. 2 of them. The receipt dated, detailed, signed in Silas's careful hand, describing Cannon's markings and the circumstances of the return with the specificity of a man who had once dealt in legal language and hadn't entirely forgotten how. And the second document, longer, more difficult, the statement about Corbin, about the night Margaret Vane was killed, about Pike's role in suppressing the investigation, about the theft of the horse and the 16 months of its absence, and the manner in which it had come to rest in Hattie Mercer's barn. Silas had written that second document in a single long session the night before, while Hattie slept in the chair and the storm outside spent itself against the mountains. She'd woken once to find him still at the desk, the lamp low, his pen moving steadily across the paper with the focused intensity of someone completing a task they'd been putting off for years. She hadn't said anything. She'd pulled her coat tighter and gone back to sleep. Now she drank the coffee and looked at him across the table, and thought about what she was carrying and what she was walking back down toward. If something goes wrong, she said. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he said, which was the automatic response of a man who didn't believe it. "If something goes wrong," she repeated. "There's a lawyer in Casper named Aldrich. He came to me with a debt claim after Everett died, but he's not in Pike's pocket. I'm fairly certain. The documents exist. Someone should know they exist." Silas looked at her. "Give me his address." She wrote it on a scrap of paper from the desk. He folded it and put it in his own coat pocket. "I have a copy," he said. She looked up. "I made a copy last night, before you woke up." He said it matter-of-factly, like it was a practical detail and not the action of a man who had spent 6 years doing nothing and had spent the previous night doing something that frightened him. "If you don't send word within 4 days, I'll find a way to get it to someone." 4 days, she said. 4 days. She finished the coffee. She stood, checked the inner pocket one more time, with her fingers, feeling the folded edges of the paper through the lining. Everything was there. Everything was in order. Whether order would be enough was a question the mountain couldn't answer. "Thank you," she said, "for the fire, the biscuits." He made a gesture that dismissed this without being rude about it. She walked to the door and then stopped because there was something else, something she'd been turning over since the previous night that she hadn't said because saying it felt presumptuous. She said it anyway. "You've been up here waiting for something to move," she said. "I think you know that. I think the waiting has been." She searched for the word corrosive, in a way that sitting still always is when you're the kind of person who should be moving. She looked at the door rather than at him. "I don't know what happens after I go down this mountain. Whatever happens, it moves. That's something." She heard him behind her, not moving, not speaking. "Go careful on the trail," he said finally. She went. The trail was exactly as bad as he'd described, soft and treacherous in places. The left edge past the second bend, genuinely dangerous, 4-foot section, where the ground had subsided away from the path and left a gap that would have taken a less attentive person's foot, and possibly the rest of them, with it. She stepped over it wide and kept moving. By the time she reached the lower valley, the sun was properly up, and the wet grass was steaming in the morning warmth, and Oak Hollow was visible in the middle distance, the church steeple, and the grain elevator, and the long, low shape of the main street. small and contained and ordinary looking in a way that she found, right now, almost offensive. She did not go home first. She thought about it. Revolver was at the farm, in the box under the bed where she'd kept it since Everett died, and going to get it first was the practical choice, the careful choice, the choice a person made when they had time to make careful choices. But she had 2.5 days left on Pike's deadline, and walking into town with the documents while she still had Pike's deadline to use as a reason for being there gave her a frame. If she went home first, changed her clothes, armed herself, then went to town, the frame shifted. She became someone preparing for a confrontation rather than someone simply responding to a legal demand. She wanted to be the second kind of person when she walked through that door. She went straight to the sheriff's office. The main street of Oak Hollow was moderately busy for a weekday morning. The feed store had a wagon out front being loaded. 2 women she recognized from the church auxiliary were talking outside the dry goods store. A man she didn't know was tying a horse in front of the saloon, with the focused determination of someone who intended to be inside for a while. None of them paid her particular attention, which was what she wanted. She walked at her usual pace, which was purposeful without being urgent, and she did not look at the sheriff's office until she was 10 feet from the door. The door was open. She could hear voices inside before she reached it, 2 of them. One she recognized as Pike's, the other, lower and faster, with the particular cadence of a man accustomed to talking his way through situations. She stopped at the threshold for 1 second, not from fear exactly, but from the instinct to gather information before committing to a position. And in that second, she heard the second voice say Pike's name, and then her own name, and then something about the farm that she didn't catch the end of. She walked in. The office was a single room with a second room behind it that served as the jail. Pike was behind his desk. A man she had never seen in person, but recognized immediately from Silas's description the age, the build, the restless quality of movement. Silas's face, rearranged into a harder and more reckless configuration, was standing to the right of the desk with a coffee cup in his hand, and his hat pushed back on his head with the casual confidence of someone who was entirely comfortable in this room. Corbin Vane looked at her. Then he looked at his brother's face in hers. She watched him make the connection, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and something shifted in his expression that he didn't quite control in time. Pike stood up slowly, the way he always did, taking his time to make the standing mean something. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you're ahead of schedule." "I had a productive few days," she said. She crossed the room to the desk and took the receipt from her inner pocket and placed it flat on the surface in front of him, smoothing it once with her palm. She watched his eyes go to it. She watched them move across Silas Vane's signature and stop. "That's a receipt," she said. "Signed by Silas Vane, dated 2 days ago, stating that I returned his horse cannon, branded double diamond. Blackthorn Ranch voluntarily and in good faith, having found the animal in my barn without prior knowledge of its theft." Kept her voice level and clear at a volume that would carry through the open door to the street outside. "The documentation you asked for, Sheriff. Within your deadline." Pike looked at the paper for a long time. "Silas Vane," he said, "is a recluse who hasn't left his property in 6 years. This could have been written by anyone." "The signature is notarized," Hattie said. This was not true. There was no notary within 10 miles of Blackthorn Ranch, but she said it with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact. Because what mattered right now was not the legal standing of the document, but the public nature of this conversation. "I'd be happy to have it verified by any impartial party." Corbin Vane set his coffee cup down on the windowsill behind him. The sound it made was small and deliberate. "You went up to Blackthorn," he said. Question. "I returned a stolen horse to its owner," Hattie said. She looked at him directly. "You must be Corbin Vane. I've heard quite a bit about you in the past 2 days." The change in his face was rapid and not well managed. A muscle jumped along his jaw. His right hand moved from the windowsill toward his hip, in a motion that stopped when Pike said quietly, "Corbin." Silas Vane is alive, Hattie said, at the same volume as before, still carrying. He is aware of the current situation in Oak Hollow. He has been in contact with parties in Cheyenne regarding a federal investigation into matters that include, but are not limited to, the theft of his livestock, the suppression of a murder investigation, and an ongoing scheme to fraudulently acquire water rights in this county. She paused. He wanted me to pass that along. The room was very quiet. Outside, on the main street, a wagon went by. The ordinary world moving at its ordinary pace, indifferent to what was happening inside this office. Pike picked up the receipt and looked at it again, and she could see him calculating the document's legal weight, the federal mention, the public nature of this exchange, the variables she'd introduced in the last 90 seconds that hadn't been in his calculation when he'd come to her kitchen 2 days ago. He was a methodical man. He needed to think. He didn't like thinking in front of an audience. This is all very interesting. Mrs. Mercer, he said finally, in the measured tone he used when he was buying time. I'll need to verify the documentation before I can close the livestock complaint. You understand, of course, she said. You have my address. Turned to leave. She was almost to the door when Corbin moved. She heard it rather than saw it, the quick scrape of boot on floor, the particular speed of a man who'd made a decision faster than he should have, and she turned on pure instinct, dropping her shoulder and twisting her weight, and instead of his hand closing on her arm, it glanced off the back of her coat. She used the momentum of her turn, and her own considerable mass, and drove herself sideways into the edge of Pike's desk with enough force to send it grinding 3 feet across the floor into the wall, Pike between the desk and the plaster, with a sound that was not quiet. Corbin came around the desk toward her, and she grabbed the brass spittoon from the floor. Beside the desk it was heavy, kind of heavy that comes from years of dedicated use, and she threw it at him, with both hands the way she'd once thrown feed sacks, low and hard, and it caught him mid-shin, and he went down onto one knee, with a sound that was mostly surprise and some pain. She was out the door before he was up the street. She needed the street and witnesses, and as much space between herself and that office as the town could provide. She moved fast, not running, because running invited pursuit and panic, but the kind of fast walking that a large woman in good condition can sustain for longer than most people expect. She went left, away from her farm road, toward the far end of the main street where Mabel Hurt's dry goods store sat between the post office and the grain agent's office, because Mabel Hurst was 71 years old and knew everyone in 3 counties and had a personal distaste for Dorian Pike that she'd cultivated carefully for 11 years. She was through Mabel's door before she heard any sound of pursuit from behind her. Mabel was behind the counter, as she always was, entering figures in a ledger with a pen she held at a slight angle because of the arthritis in her first 2 fingers. She looked up when Hattie came in, took in Hattie's condition, the flushed face, the pace, the particular quality of alertness, and set her pen down without comment. You look like a woman who's had a morning, Mabel said. I've had a morning, Hattie agreed. I need to use your back room for 15 minutes, and I need you to not remember I was here if anyone asks in the next hour. Mabel considered this for approximately 3 seconds. The thing with Pike? The thing with Pike. Back room's unlocked, Mabel said, and picked up her pen again. Hattie went through the back, past the shelves of dry goods and bolts of fabric, and the various accumulated objects of a business that had been operating in the same location for 22 years, and into the small room at the rear that served as Mabel's office and storage combined. There was a window that looked onto the alley behind the building. She stood to one side of it and looked out. The alley was empty. She gave it 2 minutes, then 3. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be, not from exertion, but from the aftermath of what had happened in Pike's office. Specific physical release of a body that had been operating on controlled tension, suddenly dealing with the fact that the tension had exploded rather than resolved. Her hands were not quite steady. She pressed them flat, against her thighs and breathed through her nose and waited for herself to settle. What had happened in that office was not what she'd planned. She'd planned to deliver the receipt, make the statement about Silas and the federal investigation, and leave on her own terms. The statement would have been enough to put Pike on the defensive, to buy time, to change the geometry of what he could do to her farm, while federal attention was theoretically moving toward him. What had actually happened was that she'd said Silas's name, and Corbin Vane had moved, and now there was a spittoon on the floor of the sheriff's office, and Pike was possibly bruised against his own wall, and Corbin knew, with absolute certainty, that his brother was alive and aware, and in contact with people outside the county. That last part was the important one, and she held on to it. The receipt was still in Pike's office. She'd left it on the desk when the desk moved. But it had been seen, which was almost as good, and the conversation had been audible from the street, which was better. She needed witnesses, she needed them specific, and she needed to find them before Pike started working on his version of events. She went back out through the store. Mabel was still at the counter. The two women who were outside talking when I came in, Hattie said, Frances Aldridge and the Bowen woman. Dorothy Bowen, Mabel said. Yes. Did they see me go into the sheriff's office? Frances sees everything on this street, Mabel said. It's her primary occupation. Good, Hattie stopped. But Mabel, if someone asks you, in the next few days, a federal authority, a marshal, anyone with official standing, I was in Pike's office this morning, and I presented documentation from Silas Vane. I stated, in that office, that Silas Vane is alive, and that a federal investigation is coming. That's the truth, and it's what happened. Mabel looked at her over the counter. Silas Vane is alive? He's alive, and he's aware, and things are about to change in this county. Mabel absorbed this. Everett always said you were the steadier one, she said. Between the two of you. Hattie didn't know what to do with that, so she nodded once and went out the front door. The two women were gone from the street she'd deal with. That later, Frances Aldridge could be found, and Dorothy Bowen was at the Methodist Church on Tuesday and Thursday mornings without fail. She had what she needed from Mabel for now. She started walking toward her farm, keeping to the main street for as long as it was the main street, where being seen was still to her advantage. She passed the post office, the grain agent, the livery stable, where Roy Givens was shoeing a horse outside with the concentrated attention of a man who considered conversation an interruption. She almost kept walking. Then she stopped. Roy Givens had been in Oak Hollow for 30 years. He had showed horses for every rancher in the county, which meant he'd been on every property at one time or another, and he had the particular quality of invisibility that comes to men whose work is physical and unglamorous people. Said things in front of Roy that they wouldn't say in front of someone they considered worth noticing success. He'd been at her farm twice last summer to work on Bess, and he'd never charged her the full amount, which was a kindness he'd arranged, so that it could be accepted without embarrassment. She walked over to him. Roy, she said. He looked up. Mrs. Mercer, I need to know something, and I need you to think about whether you can tell me truthfully. She kept her voice low. Corbin Vane has been in town for 2 months. Has he been to the livery? Roy set down his hammer and looked at the horse's hoof he was working on. The horse shifted, and he steadied it with a practiced hand. He stabled a gray quarter horse here for 6 weeks, he said, not looking at her. Came and went odd hours. Sometimes I'd come in the morning, and the horse would be wet and tired, and no sign of Corbin till noon. What direction, she said. Roy finally looked at her. Northeast of town, there's only one thing of size. Blackthorn, she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. Were you ever in the office when Corbin met with Pike? She said. I don't go in the sheriff's office, Roy said, in a tone that suggested this was a matter of principle. You might have heard something. He was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the hammer again, then set it back down. About 3 weeks ago, he said, Corbin came to collect the gray. It was early, before the street was properly up. He was talking to someone outside my door. I was inside. Not hiding, just inside, and the someone was Pike. I heard the word blackthorn, and I heard the word water, and I heard Pike say something about a letter from Cheyenne that was going to make things complicated. He looked at her. That's what I heard. Whether it means anything is not my business to say. Thank you, Roy. Mrs. Mercer. He picked up the hammer. You be careful. She walked the rest of the way to her farm in 40 minutes, thinking about Cheyenne. A letter from Cheyenne, 3 weeks ago. Which meant someone, possibly the lawyer Aldrich, possibly someone else Silas had been in contact with, through his man in Casper, had already made some kind of inquiry. Which meant the federal angle wasn't purely theoretical. Which meant Pike had known. Something was moving toward him even before this morning, and this morning had made it considerably more concrete. She reached the farm and went directly to the bedroom and pulled the box from under the bed. The revolver was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, purchased by Everett when they'd first come to Wyoming, and fired by Hattie considerably more often than by Everett, who had never fully trusted a weapon he hadn't grown up with. She checked it the way her father had taught her, before her father had become someone she preferred not to think about cylinder, action, loading gate. It was in good order, slightly dusty. She cleaned it with the cloth she kept in the box and loaded it from the box of cartridges beside it, strapped the holster on under her heaviest skirt where it was invisible but accessible. Then she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. She had been composing it in her head for the past 3 miles of walking, and it came out in a single draft, organized and specific: her name, her address, the nature of the complaint, the names of the individuals involved, the substance of Silas Vane's written statement, and the fact that documentation existed and was in the possession of a named party. She used Silas himself as the named party rather than herself, because whatever happened to her in the next few days, Silas and his copy were behind iron gates on a mountain. She folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it, and put it in her coat pocket to take to the post office in the morning. She would not go back to town today. Today she needed to let things settle. Let Pike decide what he was going to do with the morning's developments. Let Corbin work through whatever panic or anger was running through him. Let the information she'd put into the public air of Oak Hollow circulate through the particular social mechanisms of a small town in which everybody knew everything inside 24 hours. She made a fire, made coffee, made herself eat a proper meal for the first time in 3 days. She fed Bess, checked the garden, did the ordinary work of an ordinary afternoon. She was in the barn at dusk, settling Bess for the night, when she heard a rider on the eastern trail. She went still. The rider was moving at a walk, not a gallop, someone who didn't want to be heard rather than someone arriving urgently. She moved to the barn door and looked through the gap between the door and the frame at the trail. The horse was a gray quarter horse. Her hand went to the holster under her skirt. She waited. Corbin Vane pulled up the gray about 30 yards from the barn and sat there looking at the farm, and Hattie watched him through the gap and thought about angles. If he came to the barn door, she had cover, and she was inside, and he was outside, which was to her advantage. If he went to the house, she would have to move to intercept him, crossing open ground. He sat on the horse for a long minute, long enough for her to understand that he was deciding something. Then he turned the horse and walked it back down the eastern trail, and she listened to the hoofbeats until they faded to nothing. She stood in the dark barn with her hand still on the revolver and breathed through her nose and understood that the next phase of this had just announced itself. Corbin coming to the farm was not the action of a man who'd been frightened off. It was reconnaissance. He'd come to see what she had, what her position looked like, how exposed she was. He'd be back. She went inside and locked both doors, which she hadn't done since Everett died, and sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought about Silas Vane behind his iron gates on the mountain, who had said that Corbin didn't think through consequences. She thought about what Silas also was, a man with 6 years of waiting coiled inside him, with a rifle and a mountain and a property that Corbin and Pike both wanted and neither had been able to take. She thought about the copy of the documents behind those gates, and the lawyer in Casper, and the letter going to Cheyenne in the morning. Then she thought about Corbin on his gray horse, sitting in the early dark, looking at her farm. He would come back. That was certain. And when he did, he would not come alone, because alone had been this morning, and this morning hadn't gone the way he'd planned. She sat with that knowledge, the way she sat, with most difficult knowledge, quietly, without flinching away from it, turning it over until it showed her its usable edges. When he came back, he would likely go to Silas first. Eliminate the source of the documents before coming for Hattie, because Hattie without Silas was a widow with a revolver. Manageable, while Silas alive and in contact with Cheyenne was a problem with consequences. It was the logical sequence. And Corbin, whatever else he was, had the logic of self-preservation. She had at most 24 hours before Corbin and Pike moved on Blackthorn Ranch. She went to the window and looked out at the dark eastern trail, and she thought about 10 miles of mountain road, and a man alone behind iron gates who had spent 6 years building himself into a fortress and might not know the walls were about to be tested. She thought about Bess, who was 20 years old and moved like she knew it. She thought about the buckboard in the barn, which was old but solid, and the harness that she'd maintained even after selling the other horses, because maintaining things was what you did when you didn't know what would be needed next. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she went back to the barn, hitched Bess to the buckboard, and started up the mountain road in the dark. Bess did not want to go up the mountain in the dark. Hattie couldn't blame her. 20 years old, a mild animal by disposition, accustomed to the particular rhythms of a small farm and the specific expectations of a woman who had never once asked more of her than was reasonable. And now this, a night harness and a buckboard and a road that smelled of wet earth and something the old mare's instincts recognized as wrong about the hour and the direction. Hattie talked to her the whole first mile. Not commands, just talk, the low, contentious murmur she used when a situation required patience from both of them. She told Bess about the morning in Pike's office, about Corbin on the gray horse at dusk, about the letter folded in her coat for Cheyenne. Bess's ears moved back and forth in the darkness, tracking the voice, and gradually the resistance in the traces softened from active objection to something more like reluctant compliance. The road was better than she'd expected the storm had been 2 days ago, and the mountain drained fast on the upper sections, leaving the surface rough but passable. The lower section, the part that flooded, was still soft in the wheel ruts but not impassable. She took it slow, feeling for the firmness through the buckboard seat, the way you feel for ice, through the sole of a boot. She got through it without losing a wheel or a horse, and stopped on the far side to let Bess catch her breath and let herself do the same. The mountain was dark and quiet around them. No wind tonight. The sky had come clear after the storm, and the stars were out in the particular abundance you only saw above 4,000 feet, more light than darkness if you looked long enough. She didn't look long. She was thinking about timing. Corbin had gone back to town after surveilling the farm, and she thought he had. Reconnaissance first, planning second, action third. That was the logic of a man who'd been operating carefully for 16 months. Then he and Pike would need tonight to arrange whatever they were arranging. Armed men didn't appear in the middle of the night without preparation, without someone making decisions about who went and what they carried and what the acceptable range of outcomes looked like. That preparation took time. She had tonight, maybe the early part of tomorrow morning. After that, the window closed. She clucked Bess forward and kept moving up. She reached the iron gates at what she estimated was close to midnight, judging by the stars. The chain was back on the gate, padlocked. She brought Bess to a stop and sat for a moment looking at the dark property beyond the bars, and then she did what she'd done before, hammered on the iron with the flat of her hand. The sound carried in the still air. She waited. Nothing moved inside the property for a long minute. and then she saw the faint suggestion of lamplight in the upper part of the main structure, moving from one window to another, coming down. She watched it approach through the bars and resolved into Silas with a lantern in one hand and the Winchester in the other, moving faster than she'd seen him move before, his limp more pronounced in the hurry. He held the lantern up when he reached the gate and looked at her through the bars. "Me," she said unnecessarily. "I can see it's you." He was already working the padlock. What happened? "Corbin came to the farm tonight. Just looked, didn't approach, then left. He was on the gray horse Roy Givens told me about, the one he stabled at the livery for 6 weeks while he was making night rides out this direction." She stepped through the gate as he opened it. "He was doing the same thing I'm doing right now, working out the approach." Silas closed the gate and replaced the chain. "How long ago?" 4 hours, maybe a little more. I came straight after." He turned and looked at her, the lantern between them, throwing uneven light across both their faces. She could see him calculating the same mental arithmetic she'd been doing on the road up, variables and timelines, and what the logical sequence of events looked like from Corbin's position. "They'll come tomorrow night," he said. "That's what I think. You left your farm." "My farm is not the target tonight," she said. "You are." He said nothing for a moment. "You didn't have to come up here," he said finally. "I had a buckboard and a road," Hattie said. Bess was unhappy about it, but she came. She looked past him at the property, trying to read its geometry in the dark. "I need to know the layout, where the cover is, where you're exposed, how they'd approach if they came in numbers. You know this land, and I don't." Silas looked at her for another moment, the particular look of a man who has spent years being alone and is processing the experience of someone arriving in the dark to help him with a practical problem. Then he turned toward the property and held the lantern up. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you." He walked her through Blackthorn in the dark, which was the best kind of education she could have gotten, because it was the same dark Corbin and Pike would be working in. The main structure was larger than she'd realized, a house and connected barn with a wide yard between the gate and the porch, open ground that had once been kept, now grown rough and uneven with 2 seasons of neglect. Porch itself was elevated 3 steps up with heavy timber posts and a railing that was solid despite appearances. To the left of the house, running parallel to the fence line, was a low stone wall and old foundation, Silas said, from a structure that had burned before he bought the property. "That wall," she said. "It's good cover. 3 feet high, solid. I used it during the last time they came, the men with the court order." "How many then?" 4. Pike stayed on the road. She walked along the wall and felt the top of it with her hands, flat stones, dry stacked, stable. It ran about 40 feet east to west and turned the corner south for another 20. You could cover the main gate and most of the yard from the corner of that wall without being visible from the gate until someone was well inside the property. "The buckboard," she said. Silas waited. "If I position the buckboard inside the gate, angled heavy end toward the yard, it's a barrier. Anyone coming through the gate on horseback has to go around it or over it, and going around it puts them in a narrow channel between the buckboard and the fence line. Going over it with a horse is slow." She was thinking as she talked, walking the yard, measuring distances with her steps. "And if the buckboard isn't there when they arrive, it doesn't read as a fortification. It reads as a vehicle someone left parked." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Until it moves," he said. "Until it moves," she agreed. He looked at the gate, then at the yard, then at the buckboard. She'd left just inside the gate where she'd driven it through. He was doing what she was doing, running the scenario forward, testing the shape of it against the variables. "You're going to drive it at them," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I drove it up a mountain in the dark," Hattie said. "Driving it across a yard is simpler. It's not simpler if there are guns pointed at it." "No," she said, "it's not." He didn't argue further, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of man who argued past the point where arguing was useful, which was rarer than it should have been. They spent the next 2 hours preparing. It was unglamorous work, moving things, testing positions, working out sightlines in the Dark, with nothing but the lantern and their own judgment, and the occasional input of getting something wrong and having to revise it. Silas brought his remaining ammunition from the house and sorted it by firearm. The Winchester took 0.4440, and he had a Colt revolver as well that took the same cartridge, which was sensible planning from some earlier version of himself. Hattie loaded her 0.38 and put the extra cartridges in her coat pocket where she could read them without looking. She moved the buckboard to the position she'd chosen 15 feet inside the gate, angled 45 degrees, the left wheel close to the fence post. Bess she unhitched and put in the lean-to with Cannon, who acknowledged the old mare's arrival with a long look and then went back to ignoring everything, which was probably the most diplomatic response available. Around 2 in the morning, they went inside, and Silas made coffee, and they sat at the table and didn't talk much, which was fine. There was a particular quality to the silence between two people who have agreed on a course of action and are simply waiting for it to become necessary, not comfortable exactly, but not tense either. Purposeful quiet. "Margaret," he said at one point, not looking at her. She looked up, "My wife." He stopped, started again. "She would have liked you." She had no patience for people who dressed things up to make them easier to look at, called it vanity of a particular kind. He looked at his coffee, said the most honest thing a person could do was look straight at what was actually there and deal with it. "She sounds like she knew something," Hattie said. "She knew a great deal." He turned the cup in his hands. "I've been trying to figure out these past 2 days whether what I'm doing agreeing to this, letting you get involved, is something she'd have thought was right or something she'd have thought was reckless." "Probably both," Hattie said. "Good decisions usually are." He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted in a way she'd seen once before, the night he'd written the documents. The particular expression of a man who has been holding something closed for a very long time and feels it open slightly without meaning to. "You should sleep," he said. "A few hours." "So should you." "I don't sleep well." "I know," she said. "You were up all night 2 nights ago." She stood and took her cup to the dry sink. "Sleep anyway. 2 hours is better than none, and you need your leg to work tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the Winchester leaning against the wall. Then he went to the chair by the stove and sat, and she went back to the chair she'd slept in before. And she didn't know if he slept, but she did briefly, shallowly, the sleep of a body that has decided rest is more useful than vigilance right now and will take what it can get. She woke to Cannon. The stallion's voice came from the lean to not a full whinny, something shorter and lower, the sound a horse makes when it has noticed something specific and is deciding whether it warrants more. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, coat already on because she'd slept in it, hand finding the revolver by touch. Silas was already at the window. It was not yet full dawn. The sky was the deep blue that precedes gray, enough to see shapes but not details. She moved to the window beside him and looked out. 2 horses at the gate. 2 figures dismounted, one working at the chain. "Pick the lock," Silas said quietly. "Or Pike brought a key," she said. They watched. The chain came free and the gate swung inward, and both figures stopped when it hit the buckboard. She heard a voice, low and irritated, and then one of the figures moved around the buckboard's left side, the narrow channel between the wheel and the fence post, exactly as she'd calculated, and the second figure went right, out toward the open side. "Pike went right," she said. "Corbin's on the left," Silas said. She counted 2, then 3. She was watching for the thing she'd been most worried about, a third figure, someone who'd come around the fence line instead of through the gate. She watched the right fence line for 30 seconds and saw nothing, and then she watched the left and saw nothing there either. 2 men, just the 2 of them, which meant either they were confident or they were careless, and given what she'd seen of both of them, she thought it was the second. Silas moved to the door without her having to say anything. He went out the front and down the porch steps and positioned himself at the left post of the porch, and she went left, out the side door that led to the yard's edge, moving fast through the dark toward the stone wall. She reached the corner of the wall, the position she'd tested in the dark last night, and came down behind it with the revolver up, and her arms resting on the flat-top stones. Corbin had cleared the narrow channel and was moving across the yard toward the porch. He had a pistol in his right hand, held low. He was moving quietly for a man of his build, placing his feet with a care that told her he'd done this kind of thing before. Pike was coming from the right, slower, circling wider toward the far side of the house. He had a shotgun. She registered it and put it aside. For a moment, Pike was Silas's problem from the porch angle, and the porch gave Silas cover. Corbin was hers. She waited. She needed him closer, needed him committed to the line of approach, needed him in the position where stopping was harder than continuing. 20 yards. 15. He was almost at the porch steps. "Stop where you are," Silas said from the porch post, and his voice in the pre-dawn quiet hit Corbin like a physical thing. The man froze, and she heard the small, sharp intake of breath from 20 feet away. Then Corbin raised his pistol toward the porch. Hattie came up over the wall. "Put it down," she said, loud and flat, and the sound of her voice from a direction Corbin had not planned, for did what she'd hoped. He turned instinctively toward it, away from Silas, and in the moment of the turn, he was neither aimed at the porch nor at her, and she had the revolver leveled at his center mass at 15 feet, and she did not waver. Corbin Vane looked at the woman behind the stone wall with a pistol pointed at him, and she watched him work through his options. His options in real time took about 2 seconds and concluded with the particular slackening of a man who has realized the scenario has more dimensions than he accounted for. "Put it on the ground," she said. "Right hand slow. Set it down." "You won't shoot me," Corbin said. "I've been shooting since before you were old enough to hold a gun," Hattie said. "And right now, I'm not particularly inclined toward mercy. Put it down." From the far side of the house came a sound, a heavy impact, then a scrape of boots, then Pike's voice saying something she couldn't make out. She kept her eyes on Corbin. "Silas," she called. "Here," he called back, and the single word carried enough information. Upright, functional, situation managed. Corbin heard his brother's voice, and something went through his face. Complicated, fast, the expression of a man encountering something he'd told himself for 6 years he no longer had to think about. His gun hand dropped 6 inches. "He's alive," Corbin said, almost to himself. "Very much so," Hattie said, "and he's been writing things down. Detailed things." With dates, she kept the revolver steady. The gun now. Corbin set the pistol on the ground. She came around the wall and crossed to it and kicked it 10 feet across the yard before he could reconsider, keeping the revolver up and her eyes on him. "Get on your knees." "I'm not. I have 1 round in this chamber and 4 more where it came from, and no particular reason to be patient," Hattie said. "Knees." He went down. She kept him there and turned her attention to the sound from the far side of the house, which had resolved into something specific. A timber down, a man's voice cursing with the controlled fury of pain rather than anger. She moved toward the corner of the house, staying wide so she kept Corbin in her peripheral vision. Pike was on the ground on the far side of the house, his left leg pinned under a timber from the woodpile that had collapsed or been collapsed, she suspected, from the look of the remaining stack, and Silas's position on the porch above, where the woodpile met the wall. The shotgun was on the ground, 6 feet from Pike's hand. Silas was at the top of the porch steps, with the Winchester aimed at Pike's position, and his face in the gray pre-dawn light was the face of a man who has waited 6 years for a morning that looks something like this one. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. She gave him a small nod, not a command, just a check. He was all right. He was better than all right. Actually, in the specific way of a person who has just discovered that the thing they've been afraid of is smaller than the waiting was. "Find some rope," she said. It took them the better part of an hour to get both men secured, which was harder work than it sounds for 2 people, one of whom was managing a leg injury, and both of whom were managing the particular challenge of keeping armed men cooperative through threat alone. because firing at a subdued person was a different category of action than either of them was interested in. Silas found rope in the barn, proper rope, thick and well-maintained, and they tied both men's hands behind them and hobbled their feet, and Hattie searched both of them for additional weapons, and found a boot knife on Corbin and a derringer in Reichsey in Pike's coat that she hadn't expected and was very glad she'd found. Put both men in the barn, not the lean-to where Cannon and Bess were, the main barn in the back stall that had a proper bolt on the outside. Put Pike in first and then Corbin, and when Corbin came through the barn door and saw Cannon at the far end of the lean-to, the stallion with its head up and its eyes on him, Corbin went a particular color and looked away fast, bolted the door. She found Silas sitting on the porch steps when she came back around the house. He was sitting the way a man sits when his body has decided it's done standing up for a while and is not interested in negotiating about it. His left leg was extended, and he had one hand on the porch post, and he was looking at the open yard with an expression she couldn't immediately read. She sat down beside him on the step, not right beside him, a reasonable distance, and looked at the yard herself. The sky was properly light now. Not sunrise yet, but close, the deep gray had gone to a pale gray, with a suggestion of rose at the eastern edge, and the blackthorn yard, in that light, looked different than it had in the lantern dark, larger, more itself. There was a quality to the morning air after a thing has happened that's different from the morning air before it. Something has changed in the physics of the place, or maybe just in the attention of the people standing in it. 6 years, Silas said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. I expected it to feel different. Different how? Thought about it. Bigger, maybe. More resolved. He turned the word over like it didn't quite fit. Feels ordinary. Most things do, Hattie said, when they're done. He looked at her sideways. You're a strange woman, Mrs. Mercer. I've been told that, she said, mostly by people who meant it as a criticism. I didn't mean it as a criticism. I know, she said. They sat with that for a moment. The marshals in Casper, she said. Do you have a way to reach them faster than post? There's a telegraph in Lewiston, 8 miles south, he said. Corbin's horse and mine can do it in 2 hours. Can you ride 2 hours? A pause. I can do what needs doing. I'll go, she said. You stay and watch the barn. You don't know the road to Lewiston. Then tell me, he told her. She committed it to memory landmarks, distances, the turn past the old smelter site that looked like a left but was a right. She asked him to repeat the second half of it, and he did, without irritation, at the asking. She was up and moving toward the lean-to for Corbin's gray horse when Silas said her name, stopped and looked back. He was still on the porch step, still looking at the yard, and he didn't look at her when he spoke. Copy of the documents, he said. There's an envelope on the desk inside, with the Cheyenne address already on it. Take it with you to Lewiston. The telegraph agent there, his name is Harmon, will know how to forward physical mail to the capital faster than regular post. She went in and found the envelope where he'd said it was. Silas, she said from the doorway. He looked up. You're going to need to fix the woodpile, she said, before the marshals arrive. It looks like what it is. He looked at where the woodpile had been. Then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen there before, brief, almost involuntary, gone before it fully arrived. But it had been there. Go, he said, before they changed their minds in that barn. She took the gray horse, which was better tempered than its owner, and rode south toward Lewiston with the envelope in her coat, and the morning coming up red and solid over the eastern ridge. And she didn't look back at the iron gates, because she knew the situation there, and looking back was a habit she'd been trying to break for 14 months. The road to Lewiston was exactly as Silas had described it, the landmarks, the distances, the turn past the old smelter site. She took the second part from memory and got it right, which satisfied her more than it probably should have. But she was 39 years old, and alone on a horse she'd appropriated from a man currently tied up in a barn, riding toward a telegraph office at dawn to summon federal marshals, and small satisfactions were worth having. Telegraph agent in Lewiston, Harmon, was a thin man of about 60 who wore a green eye shade and had the particular quality of unflappability that comes to people who spend their professional lives receiving other people's crises in small type. She told him what she needed, and he looked at her once the full look, top to bottom, kind that registered her size and her dusty coat and the revolver at her hip and the quality of someone who had recently been in a situation and would discuss it if pressed, but would prefer to move on. And then he turned to his key without comment. She sent the telegraph first. Then she gave him the envelope and explained what Silas had said about forwarding it, and he took it and made a note in his ledger and gave her a receipt, which she put in her inner pocket with a sense of recognition that almost made her smile. Receipts. It had started with a receipt. She rode back to Blackthorn on the gray horse in the full morning light and found Silas where she'd left him, not on the steps anymore, but in the yard, working on the woodpile with a methodical, one-sided efficiency that suggested he'd been at it for a while. He was restacking the timber against the house wall, not rushing, not wasting motion, his bad leg compensating constantly in small automatic adjustments that he'd clearly had years to develop. He didn't stop when she came through the gate. "Done?" he said without looking up. "Done," she said. "Harmon sends the message and the envelope both." "Good." He set a log and reached for another. She unsaddled the gray and put it in the lean-to and checked the barn bolt and listened to the sounds from inside. Both men present and breathing, unhappy about it, not doing anything about it. And then she came back to the yard and found a second pair of work gloves hanging on the fence post that hadn't been there when she'd left. She looked at them for a moment. Then she put them on and went to help with the woodpile. They worked without much conversation for the better part of an hour, restacking the timber in a configuration that would have been difficult to explain to a federal marshal as the result of a home defense situation. Not impossible to explain, they had 2 bound men in the barn who had arrived armed in the pre-dawn dark, and the documentation to support the context, but easier if the woodpile simply looked like a woodpile again. When they were done, Silas sat on the top porch step, and she stood in the yard, and they both looked at the barn, and then at the gate, and then at the morning sky, which had gone from red to a clean pale blue, with no clouds left from the storm, and no clouds on the immediate horizon. "How long before the marshals?" she said. "Casper is half a day by fast horse. They'll want to assemble a party." He thought about it. "Tomorrow. Maybe late tonight if they move fast." She thought about the farm at the bottom of the mountain, the garden, the chickens, old Bess, who had been uncommonly patient about all of this. The letter to Cheyenne she still hadn't mailed, because she'd sent it by telegraph instead. Banknote in Casper, which existed independent of Pike and Corbin, and would continue to exist after the marshals came and went. "I need to go back to the farm," she said. "This afternoon, when I'm sure the barn situation is stable." Silas nodded. "I'll be all right here, I know," she said. "I'm not staying because I think you need looking after. I know why you were here," he said, "and why you're leaving." She looked at him on the step, this man with 6 years of waiting inside him, and a leg that didn't work right, and a house full of the shapes of a different life. And she thought about what he'd said about Margaret, that she would have liked Hattie, thought it was probably true, and that it was one of the stranger compliments she'd received, and that she didn't know exactly what to do with it except hold it somewhere careful. "I'll come back," she said, "when the marshals are done, to see how it comes out." "You'll know how it comes out," he said. "You wrote the documents." "I want to see it anyway," she said. He looked at her, and the morning was quiet around them, and from the barn came the occasional sound of 2 men who had arrived intending one thing and would leave accountable for several others. "All right," Silas said. She went to get Bess. The ride down the mountain was slower than any of her previous trips on that road, because Bess was tired, and the morning sun was doing something complicated to the wet sections of the trail, softening the top layer while the ground beneath stayed firm, and Hattie had no interest in hurrying a 20-year-old mare down uncertain footing, just because her own mind was moving faster than her body. She let Bess set the pace, and she thought, There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from the body's work, but from the sustained effort of managing a situation that kept expanding. Every time you thought you'd address the perimeter of it, another edge appeared. She'd been in that kind of exhaustion before, in the months after Everett died, when the grief and the debt and the practical weight of running a farm alone had all arrived simultaneously and kept arriving. Each day, a new version of the same problem wearing a slightly different face. She'd learned something in that period that she hadn't known before, that the mind could be trained, the way a muscle could be trained, to keep working past the point where it wanted to stop. You didn't get stronger by stopping. You got stronger by continuing badly for a while until continuing became easier. She was continuing badly right now, and she knew it, and she was all right with it. The farm came into view at the bottom of the mountain with the particular quality of something she hadn't expected to see again as soon as she was seeing it. The garden, the barn where Bess lived, kitchen window with the curtain she'd hung last spring from fabric she'd gotten at Mabel's store, pale yellow, because she'd been tired of looking at plain wood and had decided that was a reasonable thing to spend 40 cents on. Curtain was still there. The window was intact. Whatever Corbin had been planning when he'd surveilled the place from the eastern trail, he hadn't started it yet. She put Bess in the barn and fed her, and sat on the stall rail and let herself be still for 10 minutes, which was all she permitted. Then she went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote out a complete account of everything that had happened since Pike had come to her door, organized, dated, specific, naming every person and every exchange and every location. She wrote it longhand in her clearest script, and she wrote it twice, the second copy for the lawyer, Aldrich, in Casper, who she would write to separately with a covering letter explaining the situation. Took 3 hours. When she was done, her hand ached and the coffee had gone cold twice, and the light through the kitchen window had shifted from morning to afternoon. She sealed both copies, addressed them, and put them with the Cheyenne letter in a stack on the table. Then she allowed herself to sit back in her chair and look at the ceiling and feel, for approximately 4 minutes, the full weight of the past 5 days pressing down on her. Everett had been dead for 14 months. In that time, she had managed debt and grief, and a failing farm, and a corrupt sheriff, and had come out the other side of a situation that had included a mountain storm, a night road, 2 armed men in a barn, and a telegraph sent at dawn to summon federal marshals. She had a revolver on her hip and rope burns on her palms from handling a horse that had not particularly wanted to be handled. And she was 39 years old, and tired in a way she expected would take considerable time to properly address. Thought Everett would have had something to say about all of this. She wasn't sure what. He'd been a man who expressed himself in actions more than words, who showed his opinion of things through what he did next, rather than through any kind of verbal declaration. She thought he probably would have been frightened for her, and she thought he probably would have understood. In the end, she'd had no better option. He'd always given her credit for that, for looking at the actual options and choosing the best one available rather than the most comfortable one. She missed him with a specific physical weight that she'd stopped trying to describe to herself because the descriptions were always inadequate. You couldn't make language do the work of that particular absence. You just carried it. She picked up the stack of letters and went out to finish the afternoon. Post office in Oak Hollow was a narrow room attached to the back of the hardware store, staffed by a man named Whitfield, who was 63 years old and had been postmaster since before most of the current residents of the town had arrived. He was not a friend. She didn't have many of those, and the ones she had were situational, but he was reliable and incorruptible in the specific way of a man whose primary loyalty was to the institution he served, rather than to any of the personalities moving through it. He'd worked under Pike's shadow for 11 years, and managed to remain, as far as Hattie could determine, entirely uninfluenced. She put the letters on his counter. He looked at the addresses. His face did something careful and controlled when he read the Cheyenne one. Went out this morning, he said. She looked at him. A telegraph, he said. From Lewiston, I expect, given the routing. He picked up a pen and began processing her letters with the methodical attention of a man who understood that his job was to move the paper and not to comment on what it said. I've had 3 people in here today asking if I'd seen you. Who? Francis Aldridge, which you'd expect. Dorothy Bowen. And Roy Givens from the livery, which you might not. He stamped the Casper letter. Roy doesn't generally come to the post office. He sends his boy. She thought about Roy, who had told her about the gray horse and the night rides and the meeting between Corbin and Pike outside the livery door. Roy, who had said you be careful in the tone of a man who meant it as more than a conventional farewell. If Roy comes in again, she said, tell him I'm back at the farm and all is well. Whitfield looked at her over his eyeglasses. He was too professional to ask what all encompassed. I'll tell him, he said. She was almost to the door when he said, Mrs. Mercer. She stopped. There's a man been sitting in the saloon since noon, Whitfieldson said, in the tone of someone relaying information without editorial position. Arrived this morning by fast horse from the direction of Casper. He's been asking about you and about Sheriff Pike, not together, separately, quietly. I thought you might want to know. She stood at the door for a moment. What's he look like? Tall, dark coat. Badge under the coat. I saw it when he leaned across the bar. A pause. He's not the only one. There are 2 more at the hotel. Turned around. Whitfield had gone back to his stamping. He did not look up. Thank you, she said. The mail goes out at 4, he said. She walked from the post office to the saloon, which was not a place she frequented, and which registered her arrival with the particular attention that any unexpected presence commands in a room where everyone knows everyone. The afternoon crowd was thin. 2 men at the bar she recognized as ranch hands from the Garvey operation. A card game in the back corner that had stalled at some point and not resumed. The bartender, who had been working this establishment since before Pike was sheriff, and had the expression of a man who had seen everything and filed all of it away for possible future reference. The man from Casper was at a corner table, with a glass of beer he hadn't been drinking much of, and he was, as Whitfield had said, tall, and he was wearing a dark coat, and when she walked toward him, she caught the edge of the badge, the way Whitfield had described it, the glint of it beneath the lapel, present and not displayed, which told her something about the nature of his approach. He looked up when she stopped beside his table. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Not a question. You have the advantage of me, she said. Deputy Marshal Crane, out of Casper. He didn't reach for the badge, which she appreciated. We received a telegraph this morning. We were already en route. She absorbed that. The letter from Cheyenne, she said half to herself. The one Pike had mentioned to Corbin 3 weeks ago outside Roy Givens's livery. Someone had moved before she had. We've had Dorian Pike under preliminary observation for some time, Crane said carefully. Your communication this morning was clarifying. He looked at her in the direct way of a man who wants to ask several questions and is deciding which to ask first. There are 2 individuals currently at a property called Blackthorn Ranch. In the barn, she said, secured. The property owner is Silas Vane. He's armed and he's expecting you. A slight pause. Mr. Vane is alive. Very much so, she said. For the 2nd time in 2 days. He has documentation. The original copies. I can tell you exactly what they contain and what they establish. Crane looked at her for a moment, the full look again, the one that registered all the variables, and then he pulled out the chair across from him. Sit down, Mrs. Mercer, he said, and tell me everything from the beginning. She sat. She talked for 40 minutes, and he listened in the manner of a professional listener, asking questions at the right points, not interrupting at the wrong ones, making notes in a small book with a short pencil. She told him about the horse in the barn and Pike's visit and the mountain trail and the storm and Silas's and the documents. She told him about the morning in Pike's office, the receipt, the statement, Corbin's movement, and the spittoon, and the broken contact. She told him about Corbin at the farm at dusk, the night drive up the mountain, The pre-dawn arrival of both men through the gate, the sequence of it. She told him about the telegraph from Lewiston and the envelope she'd given to Harmon and the woodpile. When she finished, Crane closed the notebook. The Halverson family, he said. The North Pasture. The Buell property. She looked at him. They're in the file, he said. Going back 7 years. Pike has been systematic. He said the word the same way she'd thought it, and with the same implication. Your situation gave us something specific. Named individuals. Documented. Dated. A chain of custody on the stolen animal that connects directly to the murder 6 years ago. Corbin Vane killed Margaret Vane, Hattie said. Yes, he said it simply, without hedging. We believe so. Mr. Vane's statement will be material. She thought about Silas behind the iron gates, riding through the night with the lamp low and the storm outside, writing the account of the worst night of his life in his careful, deliberate hand. She hoped someone would tell him that it had been sufficient, that the writing had been worth the writing. One more thing, she said. Crane waited. My husband, Everett Mercer, sir. He purchased that horse cannon in good faith. He didn't know its origin. He died not knowing. She kept her voice level, because this was not the moment to be anything other than precise. I need his name cleared formally in writing. Whatever documentation your office produces that addresses the theft and Corbin Vane's responsibility for it, I need Everett Mercer's name in that documentation as a party who acquired stolen property unknowingly without culpability. Crane looked at her steadily. That's a reasonable request. It's not a request, she said. It's a condition of my full cooperation with your investigation. A pause. Understood, he said. She stood. When are you going up to Blackthorn? This evening. I have 2 men with me. He rose as well, which was a courtesy she registered. Mrs. Mercer, you should know what you did. Walking into Pike's office with those documents, making it public that mattered. Couldn't suppress it after that. Half the town heard you say Silas Vane's name. The whole point, she said. Yes, he said. But knowing the point and being able to execute it under that kind of pressure are different things. She looked at him for a moment. I had a receipt, she said. Clarified my thinking considerably. She left him there with his mostly untouched beer and walked back through the main street of Oak Hollow in the afternoon light and felt the town around her as she hadn't felt it in 5 days, not as a threat or an obstacle or a system organized against her, but simply as a place full of ordinary people, living ordinary lives with a particular mixture of knowledge and willed ignorance that made small-town survival possible. Frances Aldridge, who saw everything. Dorothy Bowen, who was at the Methodist Church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Roy Givens, who showed horses and heard things, and didn't go to the sheriff's office as a matter of principle, but knew which information was worth passing along. She had underestimated how much was already moving around her, under the surface, in the spaces between the things people said aloud. She had been so focused on her own situation, the farm, the debt, the deadline, that she hadn't fully registered how many other people were carrying their own version of the same weight. Pike's 11 years of systematic pressure had bent a lot of people quietly in ways they hadn't had the means or the safety to push back against. She had given them something to point at. That was part of what the morning in Pike's office had done. She thought about that on the walk home, and she thought it was probably the most important thing she'd done in the whole sequence. Smoke. More important even than the night on the mountain, not the dramatic pieces, not the buckboard through the gate or the spittoon through the air, but the standing in the middle of a public room and saying a name out loud so that people who already knew things but had no framework for them suddenly had a framework. Names out loud in public rooms. That was what changed things. Not always immediately, not always completely, but it changed the angle of everything that came after. Almost home when she heard the horse behind her. Turned. Roy Givens, on a horse she recognized from the livery, riding at a walk, pulled up beside her. Whitfield told me, he said. I know, she said. He looked at the road ahead for a moment, both of them walking now, him on the horse, her on foot, the way they'd somehow ended up. Pike had a paper on my livery, he said, going back 4 years. I owed on a piece of equipment I bought from a man who turned out not to have owned it outright. Pike found out, and he's been holding it. He said it, the way people say things they've been carrying a long time, not dramatically, just with the flatness of something that's worn its edges smooth. I should have said something. When the Halversons lost the pasture, when Buell's place burned, I knew things I didn't say. You said them to me, Hattie said. Not enough. Not soon enough. She walked a few paces. Roy, the marshals are here from Casper. 3 of them, at the hotel and the saloon. There's a man named Crane who will want to talk to anyone with specific information about Pike's methods over the past several years. She looked up at him. That equipment paper Pike's been holding it goes away when Pike goes away. He sat with that for a moment, the horse moving steadily, the afternoon light, long and golden across the road. I'll talk to him, Roy said finally. Good, she said. He rode back toward town, and she walked the last quarter mile to the farm alone. She did her evening chores, the garden, the chickens, Bess already in the barn and apparently willing to forgive the previous night's adventure, given sufficient oats. She made a simple supper, ate it at the kitchen table, washed the plate and cup. She sat for a while in the chair, by the window, where the yellow curtain moved slightly in the evening air, and looked at the eastern trail, which was quiet, thought about the farm, the banknote in Casper, which was still real, still owed, the 2 milk cows she'd sold that weren't coming back, the mending work from the 3 families in town, which would continue until she had another source of income, or until those families decided they'd done enough, whichever came first. Pike going away solved the immediate crisis, the threat of property seizure, the manufactured theft charge, the specific pressure he'd been applying, but it didn't solve the underlying mathematics of a widow on 31 acres with 1 old horse and a garden and a debt load she could service but not clear. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. Honesty about the actual situation was the first requirement, and the actual situation was that the crisis was addressed, but the condition remained. She would still need to figure out how to make the farm viable. She would still have the banknote. She would still be alone on the property, doing the work of 2 people with the resources of 1. It was a familiar kind of hard, and familiarity didn't make it easier, but it made it legible. She could read this kind of hard. She'd been reading it for 14 months. She went to bed at dark and slept deeply for the first time in 5 days, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it. The marshals came back down from Blackthorn the following morning with Corbin Vane and Dorian Pike in custody, both men on horses with their wrists bound to the saddle horn, and they came through Oak Hollow's main street at a pace that made sure everyone saw. Hattie was at the post office when it happened, mailing the second set of letters, and she walked out to the street and stood in front of Whitfield's door and watched the procession pass. Pike looked straight ahead. She gave him credit for that. At least, he didn't look at the people watching from the storefronts, didn't acknowledge the audience, kept his eyes on the road ahead with the specific rigidity of a man maintaining what dignity the situation allowed. Corbin looked at the ground. He had the posture of someone who had spent the night in a barn stall, working through the implications of his position, and had arrived at a place that was not comfortable. As he passed Hattie's position on the street, he looked up once, briefly, and their eyes met. And whatever he saw in her face made him look away again, without speaking. She didn't have anything to say to him either. She watched them pass and then went back inside to get the postmaster's receipt for her letters. Crane stopped his horse in front of her when the procession had passed. Mr. Vane sends his regards, he said. She looked up at him. How is he? Well, better than expected, given the circumstances. Crane looked down at her from the horse, with the expression of a man who had done this job for some years, and was occasionally surprised by the shape things took. He wants to know if you'll come back up the mountain. She looked at the eastern trail, visible from the main street if you knew where to look. He's going to need to testify, she said. He knows that. We've made arrangements that accommodate his situation. A pause. He said you'd ask about practicalities first. She considered this. What did he say about after the testimony? He said after was still being determined. Crane gathered his reins. Mrs. Mercer the reward. She'd forgotten about it. There was a reward on the Blackthorn theft. She'd seen it on the board in the post office months ago, before any of this. Before the horse had appeared in her barn. $50 for information leading to the recovery of a branded stallion. Give it to the Halverson family, she said. For the pasture. Crane looked at her for a moment. That's not exactly how rewards work. Figure it out, she said. He rode on. She walked back to the farm. It was 3 days before she went back up the mountain, which was not because she was hesitant, but because there were things that needed doing at the farm. First, the garden, a fence section that had been deteriorating since February, the letter to Aldrich and Casper that she wanted to write properly rather than quickly. She dealt with each thing in sequence, the way she dealt with all difficult things. And on the morning of the 4th day, she hitched Bess to the buckboard and started up the mountain road in the early light. The trail was drier than it had been on any of her previous trips. Spring was settling into itself now, the violent melt and flood of early season, giving way to something more stable. And the road up the mountain was almost pleasant in the way roads can be when the air is clean and the light is right, and you're not driving toward something actively dangerous for once. Cannon heard them coming before she reached the gate. She heard him from 20 yards out, that low, particular sound he'd made. The morning the marshals came, the sound of a horse registering something specific in the approaching noise. And then she heard Silas's voice from inside the property, not the words, just the voice. And then the gate was opening before she'd stopped the buckboard. He looked different in full daylight, which she'd barely seen him in across their previous encounters. The beard was still there, but shorter. He'd trimmed it since she'd last been at the property, which was a detail she registered without comment. His leg was still the same. He moved aside to let the buckboard through and then closed the gate and looked up at her on the buckboard seat. You came, he said. I said I would. He looked at Bess, who looked back at him with the mild indifference of a horse that had strong opinions about mountains but was currently managing. I'll put her in the lean-to. She won't argue, Hattie said. They put Bess in the lean-to, where Cannon regarded the old mayor's return with the same diplomatic indifference as before. And then they went inside, and Silas made coffee, which was becoming. She noticed a pattern between them, the coffee first, conversation after, the hot cup, as a way of establishing the basic terms of a civil exchange before anything complicated got said. She sat at the table where she'd sat the first night in the storm when he'd written documents, and she'd slept in the chair, and they'd both been operating on about 2 hours of rest and a combined weight of difficult things. The table looked the same. The stove looked the same. Books were still in the corners. The tools no longer on the table. The lamp in the same position. Different, though, in a way she couldn't immediately identify. And then she did. It was cleaner. Not clean exactly, but cleaner than it had been. Like someone had made a decision about the space and acted on it, modestly, without drama. The marshal's testimony arrangement, she said. How does it work? A man from their office will come here. I give the testimony here. He set the coffee down and sat. Done it before, apparently. For circumstances where travel is complicated. Your leg. My leg and other things. He looked at the cup. I haven't been off this property in 6 years. The leg is part of it. The leg is not all of it. She thought about how to respond to that and decided on the direct approach, because the direct approach had generally served her better than the careful one. What's the rest of it? He was quiet for a moment. When Margaret died, he said, the world outside the gate was the place that contained the thing that happened. It was the place that had Corbin in it, and Pike, and the hands who disappeared, and everyone who knew and said nothing, because saying something had a cost. He looked at his hands. Here was just the ranch. It was just the work. It was just the place that still had her in it, the way a place holds a person even after they're gone, in the positioning of things, in the habits of a space. He stopped. I told myself I stayed because of the leg and because of Corbin's reach. Those were true. They weren't the whole truth. She drank her coffee and let that sit in the room for a moment. The gate was open when I came through, she said. You'd already unlocked it before I reached it. I heard the buckboard. You hear a lot from this property, she said. You heard the marshals coming from a quarter mile. He looked at her. I think you know the gate can open, she said. I think that's different from 6 years ago. He considered this for a long time, and she let him consider it, because pushing a person toward a conclusion they were already reaching was counterproductive and also unkind. Crane said something, Silas said finally. Before they left, he said that Say was strong, that Corbin would answer for Margaret. He said her name without the careful avoidance of the previous conversations. Just the name, direct. He said it might take a year, through the courts, but the evidence was sufficient. It will hold, Hattie said. The documents are specific and the chain of custody is clean, and you have a corroborating witness in me for the horse's return. She paused. Corbin is going to try to negotiate. He'll offer Pike to reduce his own exposure. Pike will offer whatever he can to reduce his. They'll spend the next year doing what men like that do, which is try to find the exit, and there isn't one. And eventually the courts will arrive at the same place the evidence already is. Silas absorbed this. You talk like a lawyer. I talk like a woman who had to learn to read legal documents on her own at 38 because there was no one else to do it, she said. It's not the same thing, but it produces some of the same habits. Corner of his mouth moved. She was getting better at reading, that it was the closest he came to a smile, and it was genuine even when it was small. The ranch, she said. Blackthorn. What happens to it now? Stays mine, he said. It was always mine, legally. The water rights, the north pasture, all of it. Crane confirmed the seizure attempt 6 years ago was never completed because I filed the injunction before they could finalize it. He looked at the window. I've been operating at minimal capacity for 6 years. The herd is down to 40 head from over 1,000. The south fence is in poor repair. The bunkhouse is uninhabitable. He said it plainly, without self-pity. The way you say things about a situation you're finally looking at squarely after a period of looking away. It would take significant work to make it viable again. Significant work and another person, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. I'm not talking about anything romantic, she said, before he could construct a response to something she hadn't said. I'm talking about the fact that you have 40 head and significant acreage, and a bunkhouse that needs rebuilding, and a leg that limits certain kinds of work. And I have 31 acres of flat farmland with a banknote attached to it, and the physical capacity to work in ways your leg makes difficult. And neither of us is in a position where our current arrangement is sustainable long term. She put the cup down. I'm proposing a practical arrangement. You've seen what I can do under difficult conditions. I've seen what you can do under the same. That's seen more information than most people have about a potential partner before they make a decision. The word partner sat in the room. Silas looked at her steadily. You'd leave the farm. I'd address the banknote, Crane suggested. The recovery of the water rights case might produce some remedy for affected parties, and the Halverson situation sets a precedent for redress. If that materializes, I can clear the note. If it doesn't, I can make other arrangements. She paused. I'm not leaving the farm. I'd be coming to something. There's a difference, he said. A significant one, she said. Yes. He stood up and went to the window, the same move she'd seen him make before, when he needed to think, when the conversation had gotten to a place that required more processing space than a chair could provide. He stood looking out at the yard, at the gate, at the trail beyond it that led down the mountain to the world that had contained all the difficult things. And also, apparently, this woman's and everything she'd walked up here carrying. The house is not in good order, he said. I've noticed, she said. I have opinions about that. I don't doubt it. The kitchen is workable. The rest is a project. I've been meaning to address it. For 6 years, she said. Yes, he said, without defensiveness. She stood up and took her cup to the dry sink, the same as she'd done on the first night, and rinsed it with the water in the bucket. I'm not asking you for a decision today, she said. I'm asking you to think about whether a practical arrangement between two people who have demonstrated they can function under pressure and communicate honestly and tolerate each other's company for extended periods is something worth considering. Turned from the window. You stayed in that chair for 36 hours and didn't complain once. I complained internally, she said. I'm not a saint. Drove a buckboard up a mountain in the dark. I established that Bess would go if I asked her to, she said. That was new information. The corner of his mouth again. This time it held a beat longer. The bunkhouse, he said. It needs a new roof first, before any of the interior work. I've been putting it off because roofing is difficult with the leg. She looked at him. I've laid roof before. On the farmhouse, 2 years before Everett died. I'm not fast, but I'm adequate. It's a larger roof. Then it takes longer, she said. That's not an argument against it. He stood there looking at her in the morning light of his own kitchen. This scarred and solitary man who had spent 6 years in a house that still held the shape of someone else's presence. And she looked back at him in the way she looked at most things directly, without embellishment, with the patience of someone who understood that useful decisions took the time they took and rushing them was just another way of making a mistake. The north fence needs attention before the roof, he said finally. The herd's been getting into the upper pasture through a gap at the northeast corner. That needs to be fixed first, or we lose more ground than we can afford to. He heard the we. She didn't comment on it, because commenting on it would have made it a larger thing than it needed to be right now, and the value of the moment was in its smallness, in the ordinary practical shape of two people discussing what needed doing and in what order. Show me the fence line, she said. I'll look at it before I go back down today. He got his coat. They walked the north fence together in the late morning, through grass that was starting to come in properly. Now that the worst of the melt was past, and he showed her the gap at the northeast corner, a section of wire that had pulled free from the post on one end, creating a gap wide enough for cattle to find and exploit, which cattle always did because that was the particular talent of cattle. She examined the post, which was still solid, and the wire, which was undamaged but needed resetting. I'll need wire staples, she said, and the right hammer. I have both. The post will hold, I know, he said. Checked it last week. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a great many things, he said, which was not an admission so much as an acknowledgement. They stood at the northeast corner of the north fence of Blackthorn Ranch, with the mountains visible above them, and the valley below, and the town of Oak Hollow somewhere in the middle distance, small and ordinary, and no longer organized against them in the way it had been a week ago. 40 head of cattle, somewhere on the property. A bunkhouse needing a roof. A house with books in the corners and tools that had been moved off the table, and a kitchen that was workable. She thought about Everett the way she thought about him. Every day, not with the sharp edge of fresh grief, but with the settled weight of someone who had been present and now wasn't, and whose absence was part of the landscape of her life, the way the mountains were part of the landscape of this valley. He didn't diminish, because she was standing on someone else's fence line, thinking about the future. He was simply himself, complete, finished, real. She would carry him the way she carried everything that mattered not in front of her, blocking the view, but with her, a weight that was also a kind of ballast. I'll come back on Thursday, she said, with the wire staples. Silas looked at the fence, then at the valley below, then at her. Coffee's better if you come early, he said. I'll come early, she said. They walked back to the gate, and she got Bess from the lean-to, and Cannon watched from the back of the lean-to with the usual calculating attention that she'd come to think of as simply his way of engaging with the world. She hitched Bess to the buckboard, and Silas held the gate open, and she drove through and turned the buckboard on the trail and looked back at him, standing in the open gate in the morning light. He was not a man given to gestures. He lifted one hand briefly and let it drop, and that was enough. She faced forward and drove Bess down the mountain, and the trail was dry, and the light was good. And below her the valley was green with the late arrival of proper spring, and she thought about what she'd said about leaving the farm, about coming to something, not leaving something behind, and she thought it was true in the way that most true things are. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific grief of one chapter closing, so that another one can use the space. There was a week of work ahead of her at the farm before Thursday. The fence section needed finishing. The garden needed turning. The letter to Aldrich and Casper needed a response, which would come in its own time from a man who was not in Pike's pocket and would now have considerably more room to operate. Banknote was still the banknote. The 31 acres were still 31 acres. Bess was still 20 years old and moving like she knew it, though she was moving willingly today, downhill and toward home, which helped. But the geometry of the situation had changed. That was what she kept coming back to. What she kept turning over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Not whether the problems had disappeared, because they hadn't, but whether the shape of the possible had expanded. It had one woman, walking up a mountain with a horse that didn't want to be led, demanding a receipt from a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in 6 years. That was where it had started. Not with a plan, not with confidence, not with any guarantee that it would work out into something other than a worse version of the problem she'd already had. Just with the recognition that there was one thing she could do, and that doing it was better than not doing it, and that the best option available was the one she had to take, whether or not it was the option she'd have chosen if she'd been given a choice. That was the whole of it. That was the thing she'd known since she was young, learned from watching her own life and the lives of people around her, that the difference between a person who survives and a person who doesn't is rarely the absence of difficulty and almost always the willingness to keep moving through it, not gracefully, not without damage, not without days when the thing feels impossible and the walls feel closer and the options on the list all look like versions of losing. But moving, that was the thing. Moving anyway, with what you had, toward what was possible. She drove Bess down the last mile of mountain trail and onto the flat valley road, and Oak Hollow was ahead of her in the late morning light, and beyond it was the farm with the yellow curtain in the kitchen window. And somewheres behind her, up the mountain, the iron gates of Blackthorn Ranch were standing open for the second morning in a row. She thought that was enough for now. She thought it was more than enough